Thank you all for joining us this afternoon here at the Korea Society. My name is Tom Byrne. I'm the president and CEO. Our organization's mission is to promote greater cooperation, understanding, and awareness between the peoples of Korea and the United States. In accordance with the mission, the Korea Society develops programming that spans across multiple fields: arts and culture, education, business, economics, and policy. We're always delighted to work with our friends from the National Committee on American Foreign Policy on insightful programs that cover multiple facets of the U.S. ROK alliance and also Korea and the U.S.'s place in the world. It's a pleasure to partner again with the NCAFP on today's program on the global role of the U.S. dollar. NCAFP's President and CEO, Ambassador Elliott, will introduce our distinguished speakers for today's program. Before I turn the podium over to Ambassador Elliott, I would like to briefly note that Saleha Moshin argues that the U.S. Treasury has used its strong dollar policy as a weapon in the last several decades, and how that strength and America's consequent role as a democratic superpower may now be in question. I should also note that at the same time, both primacy of the dollar in international payments and trade still remains largely unchanged and unchallenged. The credit quality of the U.S. has eroded, and its fiscal strength may no longer be fully offset by the U.S. government's unique credit strengths. This includes the exorbitant privilege of the dollar as a global reserve currency. The U.S. has lost its AAA ratings from 2 of the 3 global credit rating agencies, and the third has put the U.S.'s AAA on negative outlook, owing to large deficits and rising debt, more than 1/4 of which is funded by foreign private creditors and central banks. I should note that Saleha tells me that her book will be translated into Korean, and it will probably be available in early 2025. I would like to thank the Korea Foundation and our corporate sponsors for making this program possible. You can find their names prominently displayed in the lobby. And with that, please join me in welcoming Ambassador Elliott to the podium.
Thanks for that warm introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Susan Elliott, as Tom mentioned, President and CEO of the National Committee on American Foreign Policy, and Tom's counterpart. I want to thank you, all of us, for joining not only today in person, which to me, I'm starting to treasure that we can get together and not have to just do things online, but also thank you to those of you joining us virtually for today's discussion. For those of you who aren't familiar with the National Committee on American Foreign Policy, it's a nonprofit, nonpartisan policy organization. We focus on informal diplomatic dialogues, which are better known as Track 2 discussions. We also look for, when we do those discussions, they are among parties in conflict, different countries. For example, we host dialogues between the Republic of Korea and Japan. We also host dialogues focused on how countries of the region should deal with North Korea. So that in and of itself is something that gives us a close bond with the Korea Society. But in addition to that, we hold special private roundtable discussions for our members and experts. We also have an emerging leaders program with next generation scholars. And again, we started that with scholars who focus on the Korean Peninsula. So another area where we have overlap and a lot of great collaboration with the Korea Society. And finally, we do public education programs like the one we're hosting today. This year marks the 50th anniversary of the National Committee, and we remain committed to hosting, leading, and partnering on vital topics that help shape American foreign policy. And as I mentioned, a lot of our work, especially over the last 20 years, has focused on Northeast Asia, and in particular, Korean Peninsula issues. So we are very fortunate to be, now that we've moved just about 2 blocks from the Korea Society, and really look forward not only to continuing our close relationship, but even doing more over the coming years. In addition to Tom Byrne, I want to thank Jonathan Corrado, who's the Korea Society Director of Policy. We also have Chelsea Andre, who's their program officer, and the whole team at the Korea Society, because I can see that you've got great, IT people who are recording and broadcasting today's program. So Tom has kind of set the scene for what today's discussion is going to be, so I won't really go into a big detail, but I will just say that, America's strong dollar policy has been the hallmark of our stability and prosperity. So when I heard about Saleha's book, I thought this would be a great opportunity for us to have a discussion about it. And Jackie Adams, who is going to interview Saleha today, is a member of our board of trustees, and she suggested this would be a great opportunity for us. So I guess one of the things I'd like to hear about today is, so what happens if the dollar's value is devalued and the power goes down? And how will that affect, especially our relations with the Republic of Korea and other countries, not only in Northeast Asia, but around the world? So you have their bios, but I'm just going to give you a little introduction to our speakers. We have Saleha Moshin, who's the author of the book, Paper Soldiers, How the Weaponization of the U.S. Dollar Changed the World Order. If you haven't already bought it, we have QR codes and information on how you can purchase your copy. But Saleha is the Senior Washington Correspondent for Bloomberg News, and in her role, she's covered the final months of the Obama Treasury Department and then the transition into the Trump presidency. She's also looked at and reported on the trade war, the economic sanctions, and parts of the Federal Reserve Capitol Hill, and our government's response to the worst public health crisis that we faced, in the century, which was with the COVID situation. So I also want to introduce Jacqueline Adams, who is going to engage in the dialogue today with Saleha. For those of you who don't know Jackie, as I mentioned, she has a long and distinguished career as a journalist, author, and convener. More than 2 decades as an Emmy Award-winning CBS News correspondent. She launched a second career in strategic communications. And through her boutique consulting firm, J. Adams Strategic Communications, LLC, she counsels corporate and nonprofit clients. And we're fortunate that she agreed to be part of our board of trustees. So we get her wise counsel whenever we ask for it, which is really great. So thank you, Jackie, for that. So she also serves on the board of directors for the Harvard Business School Club of New York. So anyway, I would like to turn now the program over to you, Jackie and Saleha, and I look forward to an interesting discussion. And when we come to a certain point, in the conversation, then we will take questions from the audience and from the virtual audience as well. So thanks to everyone for coming today.
Thank you so much, Susan. It's lovely to see all of you today on this rainy afternoon, and I'd like to welcome everyone who is joining us virtually. Thank you, Tom, for hosting us. It's a lovely respite from the rain today. As Susan said, I'm Jacqueline Adams. I'm a member of the board of the National Committee on American Foreign Policy, and our conversation today with the brilliant and beautiful Saleha Mohsin is quite timely. Her new book is getting a lot of coverage, and the book is Paper Soldiers, How the Weaponization of the Dollar Changed the World. For the first 35, 40 minutes or so, I'll keep track. Saleha and I are going to chat, and then I do have about 6 questions that have already been submitted, and there are a goodly number of you here, so we'll be sure to save about 20 minutes, 15, 20 minutes for questions from all of you who work with us. In the interest of full disclosure, I first met Saleha in 2018. She participated in an organization called the Diverse Future Initiative that I helped to co-found. It's a training program for rising stars of color in the media. At that point, I was tremendously impressed by Saleha's work. She, at that point, was covering the Treasury Department full-time, and since then, she's been promoted to Senior Washington Correspondent for Bloomberg Media. In addition, she is the host of Bloomberg's marquee podcast from the nation's capital called Big Take DC. And you can here for unpacked topics about the Federal Reserve, about the dollar, whether the Russia sanctions have worked, and she brings voices from across all 50 states along with senior government officials. Big Take DC, Saleha's podcast, is available on Apple, Spotify, and wherever you find your podcasts. For the last 2 weeks, Saleha has been very busily promoting this book and going to events like ours. This evening, she's at the New York Historical Society in conversation, and last week she was on for Reed Zakaria, and she was brilliant. He went over on the time that he was scheduled to talk to her, which doesn't happen very often, so that's a good sign. You can buy the book on the Penguin Publishers website. We have a QR code here, and it's a great late Easter or current Ramadan present, and birthdays are coming up, so I recommend that you purchase the book. How are you feeling? It's been a busy couple of weeks.
Yeah, I'm thrilled. I'm so excited to be here. I mean, thank you so much to the NCAFP and the Korea Society. You guys have a beautiful space here. And it's great to have all this engagement.
You told Fareed that writing this book was a patriotic duty. What did you mean?
Yeah, I told him it was a small act of patriotism. I didn't want to overdo that. There are people who fight in wars for the country, so this is a much smaller version of patriotism than that. But there is the second sentence in the book. I write that all empires think they're special, but all empires fall. And when I wrote this and reviewed it many times, to me that just meant that America, maybe not an empire in the traditional sense, but a superpower, we should not take that status for granted. It wasn't until I was finished with the manuscript completely and I went on this 2-hour hike and I decided no headphones. I had my phone on airplane mode tucked away in case I got lost only, and I was just going to take a moment to reflect on having finished the manuscript, just think about things, and it dawned on me that that line, I like it so much because it sums up the professional and intellectual reasons I wrote the book that I just shared, but also a deeply personal reason. And that is that I'm a first generation born American. I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio. My parents were part of the India-Pakistan partition. They were both born in India. And when the British Raj fell in India, that empire fell, they experienced what happens when an empire falls. In this case, 15 million people were displaced as the British left the region and the country was split into 2 pieces. My father, I grew up hearing stories about my father having to travel with his parents, spend 3 months going from India to Pakistan, and trying to avoid what were called ghost trains, where trains going in both directions, both countries, both sets of people would board, try to get to the other side, and the train would arrive with just bodies. And that's what he was trying to avoid, him and his family. He said his sister once told me that he arrived, by the time they all arrived to safety, he had lost his shoes. He was 11 or 12 years old. And that is what happens when an empire falls. And since then, my parents they pursued and then achieved the American dream. They came here and with highly educated in the 70s, restarted life, helped other people, sent money back home, brought people here to also become part of American democracy, part of the economy here. And I would hate to think that their sacrifices to leave their culture and heritage and family behind, to come to this rising superpower just in 1 generation, or maybe 2 generations, maybe their grandchildren would then experience the setting of the power of the U.S. is.
Well, that leads us to the central theme of the book, and thank you for sharing that deeply personal, very moving story. But the central question in the book is, are we reaching a tipping point in the dollar being the global currency? how close are we? Because there are arguments clearly on both sides of the point.
And Jackie, to me, where we are in terms of the dollar's power is the same as saying where we are in terms of our democratic and global strength as a superpower in the world. And we are definitely at a tipping point. Whether we've tipped over or not, I think, like I say in the first few lines of the book, we won't know until that moment has actually passed and we've already started to come down. Because in the moment, when a glacier is melting, you don't know what's happening, right?
You have described sanctions as a tool rather than a policy. We've had several sets of sanctions against Russia, sanctions against Iran. Are they working, or is there sanctions fatigue?
Jackie, that's a conversation that is a debate that's raging in every economic and political circle in every capital of the world right now. The U.S. unleashed the heaviest sanctions package ever imposed on February 26, 2022, which is the starting and ending point of my book. And the U.S. wasn't alone. I think what people forget, everyone says there are U.S. sanctions on Russia. What people forget is that more than half the world's GDP were represented in the action. It was multilateral. More than 30 countries joined the U.S., but the U.S. led the effort. Most of those countries joined because the U.S. was leading the effort, and the U.S.'s piece of that action had the most impact. Sanctions are a tool of foreign policy and geopolitical strategy. So to say that sanctions have failed is kind of like saying, my house fell apart, so the hammer must have failed. But really, the hammer is a tool that is used by the architect of the house or the building contractor. And to take that analogy to sanctions, sanctions are the tool. You can say foreign policy or geopolitical strategy is what failed in that moment. There's that part of it. The other part of it is that it depends on what the goal was. Now, I'm a reporter. I cover White House officials, Treasury officials, State Department officials, lawmakers, and when I ask them a simple question and I don't get a simple answer, I say, well, if you're explaining, you're losing, right? But I also find myself explaining on economic sanctions because they're really complicated. It depends on what the stated goal was. If the stated goal was that these sanctions will do X, and X has not happened, then you can say that they failed. But along the way, even the White House has muddled the goal of sanctions. When they were first unleashed, President Biden came out not a month after the sanctions came through and said, oh, the ruble is now rubble. The ruble plummeted 30% in value. So then, okay, the President of the United States is saying, this is how we measure whether sanctions work or not. Now the ruble has recovered, and the Russian economy is actually expected to expand by maybe 2.1% this year. The other measure you can look at is that Russia has imported $1 billion worth of microchips from the US and Europe without violating sanctions, and those chips are helping their war technology. So it's very porous. So it's too soon to know whether they've worked or not. It's a complicated question to ask, but I think it's important to be asking and to be holding the US-led coalition accountable for its actions.
There are a number of BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, who have been threatening, who have been talking about perhaps de-dollarizing. Saudi Arabia is another part of that conversation. And even our allies like South Korea have to be thinking about this, given the porousness of the sanctions to date. How should these countries who have to gauge their relationships with the U.S. and U.S. domestic policies, how should they be thinking about their own currencies and how closely to align to the dollar?
I think it's an important conversation. While I'm sitting in the Korea Society space, I think I should note that, when you hear from President Biden and Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen that they are promoting a Buy America policy, which is an extension or another iteration of Trump's Make America Great Again or America First. They also talk about friendshoring, and that includes close foreign policy and trade partners and allies like South Korea. South Korea is sort of part of the friendshoring rather than an adversary. But the reason I think in Asia, particularly, the discussion of de-dollarization has really resonated is because there's the US-led coalition of the world, and now there's the China-led coalition of the world. And when you talk about the world's reserve asset, people love to talk about who or what could be next. And the most common question I get is, oh, could it be the yuan? And there's huge implications across Asia, including, and then the rest of the world, if that does happen. Or if the BRICS plus countries or the Gulf states where a lot of oil trade is controlled decide we're going to come together and we're going to find a way to trade outside of the dollar. I would say on the one hand, there's nothing wrong to a diversification of the world's assets and how they're used. The dollar is so central to our global financial system. It's as central and entrenched as the English language as lingua franca, that you can't get rid of it easily, so no big deal if someone else is trading bilaterally in other currencies, especially if it makes other economies stronger. That's good for the global economy, and so then it's also good for the US. But the thing to kind of watch for is what happens when there's a crisis in the world somewhere, whether it's a regional crisis, a local crisis, government instability somewhere in Latin America or Asia or anywhere else, or a regional banking crisis. If you see countries fleeing to the US dollar in our treasuries market, right there is proof that de-dollarization has not really taken hold.
You talked about crises, and this morning when I was doing my check of news events around the world, I noticed that North Korea, both last month and I think in the last 24, 36 hours, have fired medium-range missiles from Pyongyang, I think. And the question is, are they testing bigger missiles, or are they testing different types of warheads? And I know I got a question from those of you here at the Korea Society who are concerned about the UN Security Council resolutions on North Korea. And they're banning hosting overseas workers and purchasing North Korean weapons, and those sanctions, those provisions are being flouted by the Russians and the Chinese. But this is kind of a jumble. We've got economic challenges, we've got military threats going on at the same time. Do those constitute, or are they the beginnings of the kind of regional crisis that you're concerned about?
I think so. You're bringing up North Korea, and there's so many U.S. economic sanctions on North Korea, and you have to wonder what the effect there has been too. People talk about Russia, but we can also talk about North Korea on that front as well. Sanctions can start, it's big, loud movements, right? And they have an effect, and there's big headlines. But the part that's unsaid and that is underutilized is sanctions enforcement. If we're talking about North Korea and we're wondering, have US sanctions on North Korea actually done anything to stem their nuclear ambitions? You have to look at the sanctions themselves, but also look at US efforts to enforce them. There's way more room, there's way more funding that Congress could give to the Treasury Department. And the Treasury Department could redirect resources or even shine a spotlight by having a Treasury Secretary talk about it, visiting the region. But until you see some of those efforts come through, it's hard to say how much more the U.S. can do in those regions.
So, again, the point that you made in the previous question was that a real threat to the dollar could be a regional crisis. Do you see, as you talk to the various Treasury Department officials and White House officials too, are we nearing a crisis in any place in particular beyond, or larger than the crises that we're already facing in Europe and I guess Europe is the main one.
I think the biggest threat really is just the global fragmentation. The U.S. was crowned, and I write about this in the book, the dollar became the world's reserve asset by design. In 1944 at Bretton Woods, economic officials from 44 countries came together as World War II was ending to say we need to become so economically integrated that we don't go at war with each other again. Because if I punch you, then it hurts me. And that's what they accomplished. They created the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and by design, everyone said, okay, now the US currency is king dollar. When you do that, you've given the US this power. And the biggest threat is not going to come from anywhere else. It's going to come from inside the US. I had a couple of really interesting interviews for the book. One of the ones I talk about a lot is the one with Hank Paulson, who was George W. Bush's third Treasury Secretary. Frankly, we were lucky to have him at the time that we did. You know, all the criticisms aside of how he managed the crises. He said to me that, and it's something he had said many times, people say it, and I thought, oh, this is a throwaway line. But when he said it in the context of the dollar and de-dollarization, it resonated differently. He said to me that as long as the US remains strong ourselves, then no foreign threat can touch the US's economic heft, our superpower status, and definitely not our dollar. So other countries can de-dollarize if they want to. Chances are, if there's a crisis somewhere, they're going to come to the dollar for safe haven investments. As long as our democracy remains strong, our rule of law is preserved, our agencies remain independent, like the Federal Reserve, Supreme Court ethics scandals, we figure out a way to revive trust between the American public and our courts and our government. So the biggest threat is actually not outside anywhere, it's inside.
We've met the enemy and he is us, I guess, she is us. A few weeks ago, just also in the interest of discussion, Saleha and I had a similar discussion a few weeks ago, so we kind of know where we're going in this talk. A few weeks ago, I heard a discussion by Austin Goolsbee. He was an economic advisor during the Obama administration, if you recall, and currently he is the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board of Chicago. And he just, and I didn't ask the question, it just came organically, he just poo-pooed the notion of de-dollarization. He said that many countries use the dollar even when they're just trading among themselves, not with the US. Is he overconfident, Goolsbee?
I don't think so. I think that the de-dollarization conversation is important and we should pay attention. The US is the world's largest economy. If you take numbers 2, 3, and 4, put them together, then you get bigger than the US. So that itself is one reason to think that the dollar is so deeply entrenched, it's going to be too hard to shake it.
China doesn't approach the size of the US economy?
No, it's still number 2, but it's not that close. We're either $4 or $7 trillion apart, and I know those are two very different numbers, but when you get that high with the trillions, you start to wonder what matters. But I think that what's interesting is that the U.S. White House and Treasury officials are freshly in a defensive posture when it comes to talk about the dollar. It used to be that people would say, get a Treasury Secretary to pontificate on the dollar and currency policy, and they wouldn't say much. Oh, strong dollar is in the nation's interest, like we're super strong, no one can touch us. Now you will hear Janet Yellen or Joe Biden or Jake Sullivan say there's no threat to the dollar and there's no alternative anyway. The minute you're saying, well, there's no one else, you're defensive. So clearly they have taken notice that you have government officials around the world saying, even officials from allies, from friends of the US, saying maybe we are too heavily exposed to the US. And it's not because necessarily Russia sanctions, it's not necessarily because the 2008 financial crisis, American-made, people still came to the dollar when they needed a safe haven. It's because the U.S. is looking uncertain. When, the dollar, if you pull it out, you look at a dollar bill, it says, "In God we trust," but actually, what that dollar means and represents is credibility in the U.S. And it's just how we're viewed. It's so fragile, actually. So if we have so much uncertainty internally, political chaos, and eventually let's talk about the deficit, then we are going to hurt ourselves more than anyone else. So when Poolsby says that, he's right. We should be confident, but not complacent. But that confidence is from no other threat out there. Where we should not be so confident, but also just be thoughtful, is the internal side.
Just as a baseline, what are the benefits to the U.S. economy of being the global currency?
So first, there's two definitions to a strong dollar. One is just the mechanism of the exchange rate, that we just have a strong currency that can buy lots of yen, lots of goods in euros and other currencies. The second one is just the hegemony, the centrality of the dollar. The world runs on dollars. You could be a Russian oligarch, you could be a multinational company, you could be picking cocoa beans in Ghana, and you need the global financial system to engage in commerce. The global financial system is underpinned by the dollar. Now, the benefits are that because we live in a country that is the owner of the world's reserve asset, we have, our mortgage rates are at the lowest possible because of that. Anytime we have credit card bills, credit card debt, or auto loans, all of our interest costs are as low as they could possibly be, especially considering our debt profile and how massive our government deficits are that low because the world has an insatiable appetite for dollars. So they want our debt because investing in this country, they know they're going to get a return. So that's the day-to-day benefit. The larger benefit is that, one, it gives us a cushion if there's a crisis somewhere else, because we will always have lots of dollars and people will always be investing. It also means that we have, great advancements, innovation, inventions, technological, pharmaceutical, because we can invest so much in research and development because we can finance such a massive budget deficit.
You have hinted several times at our current political season, presidential political season. And I know that relatively recently you've written an article for Bloomberg Business Week that there are a lot of elections happening in 2024. Where does the United States election fall in contrast to all of the other elections that are going on that we might not be paying attention to here in the U.S. because we're so introspective?
Yeah, this year in 2024, 4 billion people in the world will cast a ballot in their local elections. A lot of eyes are on the U.S. All the eyes are on the U.S. because who knows what's going to happen next? That's the other piece of the puzzle when we talk about de-dollarization and the uncertainty with which people are now looking at the U.S. because you don't know when we could get a president who could say, well, I don't care if such and such country has been our ally for decades, a special relationship, however you want to define it, I'm going to sanction them. There's more volatility here. And the effects last for years, right? People are still talking about Trump's withdrawal from the Iran deal. People are still adjusting to an America where economic policies are more isolationist, protectionist, rather than globalization, like let's just make, for the greater good. So where the U.S. is headed, and whether even, I would say, on election night, people will be wondering, are we going to get results tonight? And will the country stand behind the results? Because the kind of questions that now happen around our elections, they've not happened in living memory, and they tend to happen in unstable countries.
So what I hear you saying is that there are two major threats to the dollar: the size of our debt and the uncertainty about our upcoming election. And those are both domestic.
And they're both connected, because in order to deal with our deficit, you need bipartisanship. You need Congress, lawmakers, to be able to agree on anything. Pick it, what color is the sky, let's get you to agree on this. Unless that people can start agreeing, you can't make the tough decisions that it's gonna take to cut our deficit. It's at $34 trillion. Bloomberg News just put out a story today. Our economics team did this really big project where they looked at like hundreds and hundreds of scenarios of whether tax cuts could happen, what could happen with Federal Reserve interest rates, where health care policy could go, where economic sanctions could go, de-dollarization efforts. No matter how you slice that pie, the current debt outlook, our fiscal house, is not in order. And if you go back to thinking of things in the term of like the US being a superpower or empire, most empires start to lose their power because of deficits.
So that brings us full circle. Is the debt the chink, the proverbial opening point in our global financial armor?
Well, I explained to you all the ways that it is, but here's one way that it's not. Markets are not saying anything about it. We have one former official from Bob Rubin's Treasury sitting here, Jeff Schieffer, who will remember this, that when in the 90s, Bill Clinton had an economic policy agenda that markets thought this is not a sustainable growth strategy. Bond traders, called the bond vigilantes, punished the administration by messing with bond yields. And there's a chapter in the book called, I think it's called Bullies and Vigilantes or something like that, about how markets can bully Washington into paying attention to the deficit. And that's not happening right now. Right now, when there's a government shutdown or debt ceiling crisis, everyone just assumes these guys always figure it out, they're gonna do it again. Sure, Moody's maybe has cut our rating, but does that even really matter? Investors are still pouring money into US Treasuries, into the dollar, investing in the US.
The stock market is getting high after high after high.
Yeah, insatiable appetite. So on that front, you could say nothing's going to change. Now, when I spoke to Bob Rubin for the book, and he said this to Bloomberg earlier this year, that until markets punish Washington, nothing's going to change.
So the American empire is safe? Safe-ish?
I think so. Look, I mean, I end the book on a hopeful note. There's a, in the book, I definitely profile the big names, Tim Geithner, Bob Rubin, Hank Paulson, but I really enjoyed getting to write little stories and vignettes about these unsung heroes in the Treasury Department, civil servants who've worked there for decades. Their paintings will not be done in oil paints and hung on the walls, but they served their country. They were stewards and courtiers of the dollar. And there's one in particular who, he gets this question, he left government, he retired from government, and he says, I get this question all the time. What does everything mean for the dollar? You name it, they want to know what it means for the dollar. And he gives a line of Shakespeare, and this is the note that I end on the book on. The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves. So let's look inward. And I will then point to the American spirit, that we have, we are a strong democracy because we're willing to be self-critical. And we have had nasty moments, and we are in it again, and it plays out in front of everyone. But you have to have hope that people will be engaged, and that the nastiness will eventually, everything's come out that was swept under the rug has come out, and we will hopefully find some stability.
Well, let's turn to all of you now that we've reached a slight point of hopefulness here. And I also have some questions that came in advance. So why don't all of you here think about, we've already got a hand. Yes, sir. You want to stand up and tell us who you are?
I'll sit down and tell you what.
Okay.
My name is Sean King, Park Strategies. Got the book over the weekend. 2 comments and a question. I love your long-term view of sanctions, because I remember in the 80s people were saying sanctions on South Africa weren't working until they did. And then another great attribute of being the world's reserve currency is law enforcement, which is how Meng Wanzhou got arrested, the CFO of Huawei in Vancouver 5 years ago, because it gives us power abroad. Questions. speaking of China, politicians left and right love to bash Beijing for not letting the value of the yuan increase. But wouldn't that be at the U.S. expense? Because if the yuan is more powerful and stronger and more traded around the world, doesn't that diminish the dollar's long-term value? Thank you.
I think any currency, that's a great question, first of all, and thanks for bringing the book. I'm like thrilled when I see it in the wild. I can't even believe it. I think any currency, there is this great, if you're really into the law, Congressional Budget Office put out this great report about how other countries lost the ownership of the world's reserve assets. They looked at the Dutch florin and the British pound sterling. Usually it's the world's largest economy that owns a reserve asset. Any country that wants to own it can own it, but you have to meet a standard. So the yuan, I think the biggest case against it, and to me I only see cases against it, because it's not, the rules of supply and demand don't apply to it. The government heavily controls the Chinese yuan. What investors globally want is predictability and stability. That's why they're uncertain about America right now, because we don't have predictability and stability right now on a lot of fronts. When we had our credit downgrade, it was because of politics getting in the way of our fiscal, getting our fiscal house in order. So even if the yuan becomes this large currency, even bigger than it is, until China's government and how they run their economy is transparent, it can't compete with the dollar. One of the moments that helped crystallize for me what the book was going to be was January 6th. The insurrection happened, and setting aside everything else that you see and you feel that day, a couple of weeks after that, Bob Rubin wrote an op-ed for the Washington Post. And he said, faith in democracy and faith in markets go hand in hand. And that's, for me, I realized that the dollar and democracy are one. So then think about China. If China's government is not open and cannot be trusted by their own people or by foreign governments or companies or business people the way the US dollar and the US government is, it's not a real competitor.
I have a question that came in, thank you. Oh, and by the way, in case any of you want to hear Bob Rubin, he is going to be one of our honorees at the NCAFP Gala in October 24th, isn't it? So as we figure out the program, maybe we should have you come and interview him for that program. So I can't promise that, but it's an idea. Here's a question that came in earlier. From Jacqueline Adams, how does digital currency play a role globally, if any? And can you talk about the status of central bank digital currencies?
Yeah, this is interesting, because you can't. When I was researching the book, and I have this in one of the chapters, that in the 1860s, when the Civil War was sort of, we were in the throes of the Civil War, Treasury Secretary Salmon P. Chase saw we've got no money, we need a paper currency. Something that's not pegged to a commodity like gold. And at the time, lawmakers thought, there were some lawmakers who said a paper currency would be immoral. And I think that's interesting, that something that now we take for granted is in our pockets, everyone has a paper currency, is immoral. So that's where we're at with cryptos and Bitcoin and CBDC, central bank digital currencies, where there's confusion. Is this really a thing? Like mining, how do I find it? Why are there pictures of Bitcoin if they don't exist? So you don't want to dismiss anything. When I was writing the book, there is one mention of cryptos in the book. It was by design. I decided that either there's a couple of chapters on this or there's very, very little. I think the world's reserve asset needs to be backed by a central bank and a government. So cryptos are then ruled out. A central bank digital currencies, there's a lot of debate. Maybe the Federal Reserve in the US is behind in creating that because China is way ahead and we're always racing against China. The thing is that when the US does something, puts their mind to it, we get there first. I was just watching a movie about the moon landing in the 60s, and I think Russia had some technological breakthrough before we did, and everyone thought Russia would get there first, and boy, did we overcome that once we put our mind to it. But I do think that CBDCs, as long as like it's in its name, central bank digital currency, there is something there, but it's still tied to a currency. The Fed can issue, or the US could issue a central bank digital currency. It's basically the dollar. So until we know more about what this new animal looks like, it's hard to know what to predict.
Any more questions? Yes? Yes.
The question is Russia in some way a case study for a country that is de-dollarized because its foreign exchange assets are seized by Western governments. It has been expelled from the SWIFT international payment system, and so it's not conducting transactions, as far as I know, international transactions in dollars. But yet, as you mentioned, it hasn't collapsed. The ruble has recovered, and it might have economic growth. So, how does this work? Is it because the world is now either the U.S. is no longer global hegemon, the revisionist powers led by China are permanent to the dollar?
I think it's a brilliant case study, actually, to look at Russia's economy and to see how it's reacted, how it's been nimble, and some of the preparations, because in advance, between Crimea's annexation in 2014 and 2022 with Ukraine, Putin had taken his war chest, $500 billion, and divested away from dollars quite a bit, and moved toward gold and yuan and other assets. So there was some he laid some groundwork. And then now, when sanctions came down on Russia, it was interesting to see that wealthy Russians were looking for a way to store their wealth, but not in dollars, because they needed to be able to access it somehow at some point. So they were buying Bulgari watches and Rolexes, thinking, well, at least it's somewhere, because we don't want it in rubles. And there's a couple of great examples. There's two more recent ones. One, Russian local companies are raising debt in yuan, local debt in yuan, but they're running into roadblocks, which shows that you can talk about de-dollarization as much as you want. When it comes to the reality, it's harder to ditch the dollar than you think, because there's not enough liquidity, and there's volatility because of all the government intervention in the yuan. And so those businesses say, well, we can't count on this investment because we could turn around and come back to it and it's not there, or it's melted away. Whereas the dollar, you can leave it, but you come back even 10 years later, you will find it, because the U.S. will always fulfill its faith and credit in its debt. And our country was built on that. It's one thing I should mention. Alexander Hamilton said that our debt is at the price of our liberty, so we need some debt, not as much as we want. But returning to your question, I think Russia's a great case study. It's showing all the roadblocks, but that also means that the next time around, someone can say, okay, these were the roadblocks the last time a country tried to get away from the dollar, and let's overcome that as we pave the way for the next move.
You mentioned earlier that Russia has imported $1 billion worth of microchips, even though sanctions are in place. How do they do that?
They did that without violating any sanctions, because there's no export controls. And so Russia imported $1 billion of European and American chips to, use in their war technology. The U.S. is a little bit afraid to actually impose export controls because of the ricochet effect, which was the ultimate goal of Bretton Woods, right? So that we have an economic brotherhood, and we can't hurt you because it hurts ourselves. And I think the sting, it's an election year, so the sting 2 years ago of those first big sanctions, Americans went to the gas pump and their gas prices were higher. And at the time, polls showed that most Americans were willing to pay a premium to protect a democracy that, in Eastern Europe. But an election year, after inflation has really eaten into people's household incomes, maybe they're not willing to. And Biden, no one wants to take that responsibility on.
Anyone? Yes. You could give us your name.
My name is Sergei Shupilko. I want to talk about the reckless policy of current administration staffed by follower of Jacequline, started by me, of course. And with this sanction to Russia and with this terrible proxy war in Ukraine, they put us in America on the brink of the nuclear war. What is your opinion about this?
I don't really have an opinion. I haven't paid attention to nuclear ambitions of different countries. I mean, on the economic side, it's one of those things where it will damage the global economy as much as I can elaborate.
Yes, Jeff. This is the chairman of our board, Jeff Schick.
I could ask you a lot of things, I decided to ask one. I have an answer, but I'd like to hear yours. Overall, if you look at the use of sanctions across countries, across regions, how effective do you think they are, and to what extent does that depend on whether it's just the U.S. and some others, or it's much of the world, which was the case in South Africa? I've always thought that maybe only a good example of success of that.
That's a great question. I think multilateral is always the way to go. So if the U.S. becomes belligerent and is just throwing a dart on the map and saying sanction on our own, no real strategy, that is terrible for the dollar, it's terrible for our foreign policy objectives. Nothing can end or curtail the reign of the dollar faster than something like that. As long as the world comes together on as many of these big objectives, but particularly economic sanctions, then it's not just the U.S. acting alone, everyone is sharing the responsibility. Which is why I pointed out at the beginning that it's U.S.-led sanctions on Russia. 30+ countries came together. And so multilateral is the best way to protect the dollar as well and the U.S.'s status. But we do have one presidential candidate who doesn't mind working unilaterally. I mean, it happened with the Iran deal. Trump pulled out of the Iran deal, and an interesting thing happened, and I talk about this in the book, that Europe wanted to stick to the JCPOA, but they had to figure out how can we continue to trade with Iran without violating U.S. sanctions. So they said, okay, we're gonna create a special purpose vehicle where we can trade with them and not touch the dollar system. The U.S. Treasury Department sent some stern letters to allies in Europe, and it turned out no country wanted to own that special purpose vehicle. It needed to be backed by a finance ministry. It had to be housed, it needed a home somewhere. People would share in it, but it needed to be located in someone's office. No country wanted to take it because no one wanted to go against the U.S. But still, those were unilateral, and that time maybe we survived, but you just have to wonder how many times can we play that same card of going unilateral when the rest of the world is going in a different direction, and then still win.
How many Treasury Secretaries did you interview for the book?
Every living Treasury Secretary except for Michael Bloomberg, so I think that's 6.
And how many other Treasury officials?
I interviewed 150 Federal Reserve, Treasury, IMF, and foreign finance ministry officials.
What do you know about all of these people who are sort of nameless and faceless to most of us? Their signatures are not on the dollar except for the Treasury Secretaries. What did you learn about them? What should we know about them?
One of my favorite videos in the book is about this woman named Andrea Gacki. She was for a long time the director of Treasury's Sanctions Office, which is called the Office of Foreign Assets Control. She's now over in another part of government. And she's a civil servant, apolitical, not Senate confirmed. And her signature is this like loopy A's, and Andrea A. Gacki is how she signs it. And she is this unassuming person. You know, she'll tell you silly things like, it takes me 6.5 minutes if I walk at a brisk pace to get from my office to the undersecretary's office. She works when she was OFAC director, her office needed what's called a SCIF, a little compartment that's been secured so that she can look at classified documents. And this office that's so powerful around the world and can impose sanctions, her office SCIF is actually a bathroom. All the plumbing's been taken out and it's just been turned into this compartment. And her signature, her loopy signature, is so powerful. She signs a document and sanctions are now imposed. You put it up on treasury.gov's website. Every bank in the world, every major financial institution now has to abide by those sanctions. And if she calls you up, you could be HSBC or BNP Paribas, both companies, giant, who have faced multi-billion-dollar fines because you have crossed what OFAC said you should do. And they're so powerful, the unit she oversaw, and now her successor oversees, is so powerful that, Elf Cosmetics, if you go to CVS or something, you'll see Elf Cosmetics everywhere. They were making false eyelashes, and a chemical to make them came from North Korea. OFAC figured it out and fined them $1 million, saying you can't use North Korean products. So that's the power of the office of this one woman.
Is there any other question? Yes.
Excuse me over here.
Sheila.
Yes, hi, I'm Sheila Hopkins. My question is this. Given that the dominance of the dollar is very much tied to the strength of our democracy, which is in a not so healthy condition right now, what did you hear from the secretaries that you've interviewed regarding their view of whether our democracy will survive what we are currently going through?
It's a great question.
And that should be the final question because it's over to spend an hour.
So when I interviewed Tim Geithner, who was Obama's first Treasury Secretary, I think he was the last of the Treasury Secretaries that I spoke to. And I spoke to him in January of 2022, so this is before Russia invaded Ukraine, before those big sanctions came down. But we've been through January 6th, we've been through Trump, we still had a Congress that was divided and a country that was so divided. Not everyone could agree who won the 2020 election. And as a journalist, usually I don't show anyone my questions when I'm interviewing you. For the book, I did, because I'm asking these people questions about something that happened 15, 20 years ago. So yeah, I want you to be prepared, right? He went through everything. It was a lovely conversation. At the very end, he said, before I let you go, Saleha, I just want to add one thing. I know you got your idea for what your book's going to be, but I just want to say that the integrity and credibility and power of the Treasury Department, it's not in a statute in law somewhere. Other finance ministries in the world, there are laws that give them the powers that they have, not in the US. He said in Treasury, that integrity comes from the people who work inside the building. The civil servants all the way up to lower level political appointees, and then Senate confirmed officials, and then the Treasury Secretary, his or herself. And he said that the next generation of economic officials inside the building are going to have to cope with running a Treasury Department that is part of a country that has a diminished standing in the world for a little while. And maybe I'm adding for a little while because I'm hopeful, but he just edited it there, saying that it's a different country. We can't just walk in with this swagger, we're the US, so you have to listen. Our standing globally has dipped. And that's a different type of management, a different type of economic diplomacy and policy making, domestically and internationally. And a couple of weeks later, Russia invaded, all of that happened, and for me, I had written like 80% of the book at that point, but the camera lens, it just shifted around and I looked at everything differently. And it just became about how the US is entering a different world order.
So is what you're saying that because America was perceived as being somewhat weaker, that Russia felt free to invade Ukraine.
I mean, in August of 2021, we had the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and I think then it became clear that the American electorate has no appetite for kinetic war. And I think it's been out there that a lot of people say and surmise that that was part of Putin's calculation. He realized that the U.S. won't send military troops on the ground because the U.S. doesn't want it after the Iraq War, after Afghanistan, everything. Americans don't want that kind of war.
Well, we're going to have to come to an end. Our hour is up, and you've given us reasons to be hopeful and reasons to be very gloomy. So, thank you. How the weaponization of the dollar changed the world order. And thank you to the Korea Society. Thank you to the National Committee on American Foreign Policy. And if you want to hear Saleha again today, and you're in New York, she's at the New York Historical Society at 6:30. Thank you, everyone. Have a nice afternoon.